Hi, I'm Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Delighted to welcome for the first time Justin Wolfers, who is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan, which you can probably tell from the Wolverines hat behind him. Welcome, Justin.
Go blue.
So, Justin, let's start with tariffs. The Federal Reserve has been in this kind of balancing act, wanting to perhaps lower interest rates, but concerned because inflation has been kind of persistent. Now that you have these on again, off again tariffs, what does the Federal Reserve do? Is that going to freeze them? Is that going to impair their ability to lower rates? What are they supposed to do?
Okay, so let me go back 3 months and tell you where they were because so much has changed.
Yes.
So 3 months ago, Jay Powell had pulled off the unthinkably good, being a soft landing. We all experienced the inflation of the COVID period. Inflation got as high as 9%. When inflation was 9%, his job was to get it back down to normal. The Fed describes that as 2%. And the idea of a soft landing is, can I do that just by pulling back enough that I'm not going to cause a recession? And he did. He got inflation all the way back down to 3%, maybe 2 point something percent. And unemployment stayed awfully close to its 50-year low, which is just an extraordinary outcome. So we were most of the way there. And 3 months ago, we were talking about what we called the last mile problem. How do you get inflation from 2 point something percent down to 2, which is what Jay wants? That's where we were. Fast forward, we've now got tariffs. So the way economists describe this as a tariff is a supply shock. It's a supply shock because in order to supply you with just about anything, a pound of coffee, I now have to also pay an extra cost, the cost being the tariff to get those coffee beans out of customs. And the problem with a supply shock is now that it costs me more to get those coffee beans out of customs, I'm going to jack up my price. So we're already seeing that. We're seeing import prices starting to rise. And the worrying thing is actually it's not just the price of the imports that rise. It's also their American competitors. Once they discover that the imports are more expensive, they're like, I mean, I could keep charging low prices, but I could jack them up because that's what my competitors have done. So we're starting to see, and we're going to see a lot more of tariff-caused inflation over the next few months. The other problem is there has been, first of all, the supply shock just causes tremendous dislocation across the whole economy. If you were previously trying to get goods in from China, you can no longer do that with 145% tariff, so you have to go elsewhere. You might decide it's just not worth it, chuck it in, and so that leads to higher unemployment. There's also something else that's gone on. You might have noticed Washington's a little chaotic. That chaos has led economic uncertainty to rise to just never seen before levels. President Trump is more effective than the COVID virus at creating chaos. And so what that does is think about if you're a CEO. If you're a CEO, your underlings brought you plans for a new project, break ground on a new factory, open a new product line, something like that. And you'd look around the world right now and you'd say to yourself, geez, I don't know what the future holds. Why don't I just pause for a while on these plans until I know what the future holds, till things look a little clearer? If everyone does that, that's going to cause a decline in the demand for construction workers, for instance. And if families go through a similar thing, they're like, I'm a little worried that we might be on the precipice of a recession. I might pull back. I might save a little more. If we all stop spending, that's what we call a demand shock. And that demand shock would further slow the economy, jacking up unemployment. Now, Jen, let's come back to the Fed, which is where you started. I'm sorry, I'm sounding like an economics professor, but that's because that's what I am. The Fed normally says, boy, I don't like high inflation. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to raise interest rates to fight that. Fair enough. Except often it says, I don't like high unemployment. I'm going to lower interest rates to stimulate the economy to fight that. So right now, then, Jay Powell has to raise interest rates and lower interest rates at the same time. Impossible. The simplest way of thinking about this is Jay Powell has a lot of tools, but he doesn't have the tools to undo the damage caused by tariffs. The easiest way to undo all of this would be reverse course on tariffs. So that's the rock and the hard place he finds himself in. How do you resolve this? So one possibility, this is what one might hope, the optimists, tariffs jack up your costs and that'll jack up your prices. Now, that would cause immediate inflation, but why would it cause ongoing inflation? Inflation is when prices keep going up. So you might just hope that this supply shock is going to cause a blip in inflation. It'll blip back down to normal. And then Jay Powell can do what economists call look through the supply shock. Realize that that impetus is going to go away. So if I ignore it, it's like a mosquito, it'll buzz away. Problem is, he's worried, particularly after COVID, that people might see prices rising and think, well, prices are rising, I might raise my prices. And then I see your prices rising and then I'm going to raise my prices. And on it goes. And so you're worried about reigniting the inflation process. So that's his fear on that side. So if you didn't have that fear, you would just say, well, this inflation is going to be a temporary blip. Look through it. I see the economy is slowing. Let me do what I can to help, which is to say lower interest rates. But still, if he's not sure, he still faces this trade-off between the two. How do you weigh them? About 6 months ago, everyone was of the view that the inflation would be the bigger problem and it would lead Powell to raise rates. You go back though, we've actually seen this movie before. In 2018, the president imposed tariffs. And if you go back and you read the Federal Reserve staff reports at the time, they show the Federal Reserve staff was more worried about a slowing economy than the inflation implications.
Interesting.
So back in 2018, they were making plans as a result of tariffs to lower interest rates. It seems reasonable to believe that they're going to follow that script again. One more asterisk, and then I'm going to stop talking. The asterisk is, Jay Powell is like a lot of American CEOs. He doesn't know what's just over the horizon, and he doesn't want to make a lot of plans based on a guess. So what he's doing is waiting to see what's going to shake out. And so basically the Fed's going to be doing nothing during the chaos. One hopes the chaos doesn't take another 3.5 years. And then once he thinks he sees what's going to happen to the economy and sees what's happening with policy, then we'll start to see some monetary policy changes.
Got it. Now, you indicated that this is really a mess up and messing with the supply chain. One of the concerns that people are now having is the empty shelves problem. How does that come about? And can that be resolved sooner than, for example, interest rates? Or is that going to be an ongoing issue so long as there's this level of uncertainty?
Great question. So, look, here's the simple problem. There are fewer boats coming into America. They're not laden with stuff. Those that are coming in are half empty. And we're making just as much stuff as we were before. So if you add all those up, there's less stuff to go onto the shelves. That's the basic arithmetic of it. Now, let me turn that into economic speak. That says there's less supply. Now, if you have the same amount of demand, there's 3 ways this can resolve. So a lot of people have said empty shelves, but I want to be clear, empty shelves is only one of 3 possibilities. So there's less stuff on the shelves and people want to buy as much stuff as before. That would lead to empty shelves. We saw that early COVID.
Right.
The second possibility is there's less stuff on the shelves because the retailers have had to pay tariffs. They understand that they'll have to charge a higher price and they understand that people are going to buy less. And so this is the story where there's less stuff coming in, but that's because they're going to jack up the prices. If they jack up the prices, then we're not going to want to buy as much stuff. So scenario 2 is not empty shelves, it's higher price tags. Scenario 3, if you didn't like either of those, is there's less stuff on the shelves, but Trump smashes the economy into a recession. None of us can afford to buy any more stuff, and we won't have empty shelves. So 2 conclusions here. 1, I don't think it's a given there'll be empty shelves. In fact, I'm sort of trying to talk people back from telling that story because I don't think that's the only way that resolves. But the second lesson is, whichever way it resolves, empty shelves, higher prices, or a recession is a pretty unhappy way to resolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me shift gears a little bit to another dilemma. Right now, the Congress is pondering the next budget. We've run deficits and run up the debt for years now, well beyond what people thought was sustainable, because America has been a safe place for people to invest. People want to buy our debt. They like the dollar. If Congress is going to go ahead and pass something that monumentally increases our debt, whatever their funny math is, whatever they say it costs and what it doesn't, are we going to be able to finance that with all of this chaos in the market? In other words, is this like really the wrong time to be testing the capacity of people to buy our debt? Are we going to see people dumping debt and therefore that's going to raise interest rates? You have to raise the yield in order to get people to buy our bonds.
Great question. So let me just start by putting my cards on the table. There's an expression people often use. They talk about fiscal hawks. They're people who worry about the government debt, who think we're not being serious, who are worried about repaying it, who see trouble just around the corner. And there are those who are somewhat more dovish. And historically, I've been in the latter category. Now, there are lots of people who are fiscal hawks, and I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just taking my best guess. Historically, Republicans like to pretend they were fiscal hawks. The Tea Party group certainly seems to believe it. The problem, of course, is that certainly Trump has spent like a drunken sailor. So I wanted to lay those cards out so your listeners would know where I'm coming from. Let's now come back to the issues you raised. What's our current fiscal situation? So let's not get too deep into the numbers and just think at a conceptual level. One way of thinking about fiscal policy is what we should do is stash money away in good times so that when bad times hit, like the COVID pandemic, like the financial crisis, we're able to amp up spending or make up for the fact that tax revenues are a little worse. So save for a rainy day in good times, spend it when it rains. So then the question is if you accept that, the question is how well are we doing on that? Well, right now the budget deficit is 6.4% of GDP, which is enormous. So if you think we're currently in the middle of a deep recession, that might be appropriate. If you think that the unemployment rate is near its 50-year low, that Trump inherited a very good economy, that the post-COVID recovery is pretty much complete, and this is what life looks like, that's what I think, then you would think, hey, shouldn't this be one of those periods we're socking it away? So that's what makes me uncomfortable. Despite the fact I'm one of the more dovish types, if we're running up the debt today, I don't see how we ever stop running it up, because if something goes wrong, tax revenues are going to plummet, the need to spend is going to rise, and we're really going to be spending a lot. So that's the basic view, that this is kind of a time maybe we shouldn't be going nuts with government spending or nuts with tax cuts, and it looks like we're on track to do that. Second thing, I really want your listeners to learn the most important thing in all of macroeconomics, and it's two letters. It's understanding the difference between the letter B and the letter T. The letter B is what the word billion begins with. The letter T is what the word trillion begins with. And the thing is, the letter T, a trillion is 1,000 times a billion. So whenever you hear the word T, trillion, I want you to think of football goalposts. And whenever you see the letter B, I want you to think of 12-point font, because that's what we're talking about. That really matters, because right now you have the White House talking about 4 trillion T goalposts worth of tax cuts. They're talking about no taxes on Social Security, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. At a time when the budget deficit is already extremely large. And you could think to yourself, boy, we're going to get all this tariff revenue, except for two problems. The first is the president's already told us he's going to cut deals. If he cuts deals, we're not getting the revenue. And the second is, even if he gets the revenue at 600 billion B, 12-point font, doesn't pay for 4 trillion T goalposts. So keep your eye on that, because it really, really, really matters. You can kind of ignore the budget most of the time because it'll be either a little bit irresponsible or a fair bit irresponsible. This time we're going between a little bit and ginormously. So it's time to watch. That's the first thing. Second, what's going on with bond markets and currency markets? Well, it could be they're starting to smell some of the math I just described, and we have a Congress that appears unwilling to stand up to the president. The second thing is there is a crisis of confidence in the competence of this administration. Why did financial markets respond so badly to Liberation Day? It wasn't just because of the tariffs. It was because it showed that this is an utterly incoherent administration with no serious advisors, completely unwilling to face trade-offs or reality. So they were reacting not just to tariffs, but to the 20 other silly things that could happen between now and the next election. And so that is what led the US dollar to go down and bond yields, that is to say the rate of interest at which the US government can borrow, to go up. This was called the Sell America trade. Basically, it used to be that if you wanted to put your money in the safest place in the world, instead of putting it under a mattress, because mattresses burn, you would lend it to the US government. But what happened is the US government showed itself to be less competent, more willing to blow the whole thing up. And as a result, they're no longer regarded as the world's mattress. Now, this then leads to your question, Jen, can this lead to a fiscal crisis? So the interest rate we're paying on our debt has just gone up. That's not abstract. That's yours and my money. Think about it this way. Have you ever calculated your mortgage if the interest rate on your mortgage went up by 0.5 percentage point? I have. It's a lot of money. Now imagine that mortgage instead worth $30 trillion. It's even more money. And that's money that either you and I or future generations are going to have to pay in taxes, or it's reduced government services. Now here's the problem. If we pay higher interest rates, it makes it harder to afford everything because our interest bills are a larger chunk of things. A fiscal crisis can arise, and it rarely arises in leading industrialized countries, just to be clear, but it can arise if markets start to raise interest rates, and then that makes it harder for us to repay our debt. And if it makes it harder for us to repay our debt, they start to think of us as unlikely to repay, so they jack up the interest rates. Look, lots of working class families know what this cycle is like. You get into a little bit of debt, you can't make your payment, and then you have to go and get a payday loan. It's effectively payday loans for whole countries. We've seen that happen in Greece not that long ago. I do think we're quite some distance away from that in the United States. But that's the United States as a country which has a very stable system of laws and government and norms. If we lose that, then we could begin that cycle. And here I just want to tell one story, if I may, Jen. There is a story of a populist strongman who disliked high interest rates and so decided to install a loyalist at the central bank, which is something Trump has talked about doing. I'm, of course, not talking about Trump at this point. I'm talking about Erdogan in Turkey. What happened is Turkey had very low and stable inflation for a long time, not a long time, for a while. He installed a loyalist. The loyalist did what he wanted, which is cut interest rates despite the fact that inflation was taking off. And inflation in Turkey went up to not the 9% we had in the United States, but 85%. And last I checked, it's 38%. And if people start to think there's a risk that the value of US money gets devalued like that, then they're going to become really concerned about lending us money.
Wow. I think it's safe to say that we are not doing the things that we need to do. We are making the problems we have much worse. And overlying all of this is all self-inflicted. There's no COVID. There's no crisis in the climate. There's no international war that's forcing all this. We could stop doing this to ourselves if we had sober, sane, predictable policymaking. And I think what I'm hearing from you is America has all of these benefits, including the rule of law, including the reserve currency, including a very dynamic labor market. But we can screw it all up pretty easily. And that kind of looks like what we're doing right now. So we will have you back because you have the knack of explaining the disastrous in very calm terms. But we have to come away, I think, with a conclusion that we can't go on like this, that something's got to
listeners two conclusions. If you feel kind of stressed right now, so do I. So the only advice I have for you is nasal breathing. And
Well, it,
there is one easy way out of all of this, and it's Congress. If
yeah,
Congress steps
exactly.
up, they can insist on a coherent fiscal, trade, monetary, and economic policy.
And that is the place that we have pointed to, whether it's on trade policy or spending or immigration. Congress has to do its job, and they're not right now. So let's hope they wake up. So thanks so much, Justin. Go blue, and we'll have you back soon. Thanks so much.